Thank you. Right now, I'm speaking on this one. Can I walk about and speak on this one? Oh, how wonderful, thank you. Because I've got quite a touch of ADHD, and if I don't move about a lot, I get edgy. First of all, of course, I've got to talk about the opportunities as well as the dangers of screen technology, but I have to say, the opportunities, it must be obvious to us. We wouldn't be here today without screen-based technology. Most of us heard about this, I imagine, through the internet because of the web. We got all our details through the internet, through emails. And earlier on, Anthony gave us the opportunity to text somebody that might be, important to us. It is absolutely part of our lives. And as a travelling woman, I spend an enormous amount of time on the road because I travel around talking all the time. My family makes jokes about my technological team that travel with me. I couldn't do it without them. I've got Tosh, he's over there, he's my computer, and he now acts, as I'm sure your laptop does, as a sort of extra bit to my brain. Basically, half my life is on him, and if I find interesting things, I can just, this one I found not long ago, I can just copy them into Tosh, and I've got them forever, I hope, as long as he doesn't break. This one was a quote I found from Neil Postman about Brave New World and 1984, and I just thought it was terrific. What Orwell feared were those who would ban books. What Huxley feared was that there would be no reason to ban a book, for there would be no one who wanted to read one. Orwell feared those who would deprive us of information. Huxley feared those who would give us so much we would be reduced to passivity and egoism. Orwell feared that the truth would be concealed from us. Huxley feared the truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance. Orwell feared we would become a captive culture. Huxley feared we would become a trivial culture, preoccupied with some equivalent of the feelies, the orgy-porgy, and the centrifugal bumble puppy. That actually was not written recently. It was written in 1995. Well, actually, it wasn't written. It was spoken by a man who has influenced my life profoundly, a man called Neil Postman, who was an American essayist. And he actually said it. How did you manage to say something so brilliant off the cuff like that during an interview before, really, the web and everything had got going? Now, I think that was very prescient, and I wanted to keep it for myself. But that's the thing that bothers me all the time, ever since I started researching modern childhood. There's a lovely Gladstone quote. He said, in a state of real frustration one day, "Every time I solve the Irish question, the Irish change the question." And the big thing today, of course, is we've got Moore's law still rolling. I don't know, it can't go much longer because physics won't let it. But I don't know whether you know, but Mr. Moore was one of the founders of Intel. And way back in the late 60s, he predicted that the power and potential of modern technology would double roughly every 2 years. And it's been doing that ever since. Now, what that means, of course, is that every couple of years you've got twice as much stuff as you had before, and you've got twice as many problems as you had before, ones that you didn't expect. I mean, Postman can't have even imagined the problems that parents would face in terms of bringing up children in the society that we've got today. And I think even when Reg was doing his report, we hadn't really clocked the significance of online porn and the way that that was exploding and the way that it was becoming available through smartphones and handheld devices to children at a very early age, so that we now have the devastating statistic that the average age of logging onto this stuff is 11. And that we parents have, the majority of us, I'm sure, have absolutely no idea of what it's like. It's only when you actually do research into the subject that you discover that it is really gruesomely violent and misogynistic and readily available to any child that wants to get onto a phone that hasn't got one of the controls that Reg described. So the thing, I think, is to be aware that while there is this immense opportunity, and good old Tosh, I couldn't do without him, there are always other things that come alongside it. I mean, what else have I got on my technological team? I've got Topsy. She's my dongle. She's the one that allows me to log in and out wherever I am. But what that means is that I don't actually sleep very much because there's so much going on that I'm always logging in to check up on all the things that I need to do. I've got Tim. Gosh, where would I be without Tim? He's my sat-nav. The trouble is that since I got him 5 years ago, I've practically forgotten how to read a map. No, that's not true. I haven't. I can read a map, thank God. I got taught how to read a map. I've done lots and lots of practice in it, so if Tim ever does break down, I'll be all right. And finally, I've got, Pickford. Pickford's my BlackBerry. And the trouble with the BlackBerry is that I've discovered that I can log on any time I want. So what I have to be is very disciplined. I struggle to be disciplined, but I think I'm reasonably in control. And I think my daughter, who's 27 today, I think she's actually better than me. And I think that's possibly because, she's grown up through it and she knows when to switch off, when to put the thing down, not to have televisions in the room where her baby's crawling about on the floor. And so she's got it much more sorted than me. I think the reason she's got it sorted is twofold. I think she had the luck to grow up somewhere where she could play. And the final mantra that we got yesterday, that what children need for resilience is nature plus nurture plus play. I think that was an incredibly important part of her life. And I think the other thing that she got was an education. She was very lucky because she is actually dyslexic, but she was very lucky in many of her teachers. So she got the opportunity, she did learn to read eventually, and she got the opportunity to get the sorts of things that I think Anthony tries to inculcate in his school, which gave her a mind of her own, the ability to think for herself and make sensible decisions. So I hope she's all right. I shouldn't say these things, should I, that she's brilliant, but I think she's got a pretty good fix on it. And it was that was worrying me when I first started looking at the whole business of modern childhood. That what worried me was I was seeing and hearing from teachers back in the 90s when Postman was saying those things. I was hearing from teachers that they were frightened that kids weren't able to learn as well as they did. They'd noticed the three things that Susan Greenfield pointed out yesterday on the film that those of us who were here yesterday saw, that there were more problems for kids in focusing attention. That had been noticed by many, many, many hundreds, maybe thousands of teachers that I was talking to when I was out on the road talking about literacy back in the 90s. There's also, they were noticing, problems with controlling impulse, more difficulty in delaying gratification and more impulsive behaviour. And they were also spotting, and the line they gave were, and I wrote notes in my diaries as I was walking. This is why I wrote the books, because I was concerned by the number of times I was hearing these same things from teachers. That the other line, so there was focus, impulse control, and the final line was not getting along with each other as well as they used to. There were more little niggles, more issues to do with bullying. And this was generally, it was most of the time just small niggles, but and in all sorts of areas, every social class, coming out in different ways, particularly in less advantaged areas, in poor language development, because they felt that listening skills were going downhill and that was damaging language. And I ended up, the book that I wrote ended up looking at 10 aspects of childhood, in each of which the experts that I interviewed, and I spent ages travelling around interviewing experts, but in each of those areas, experts could see how the effects of modern life could be affecting possibly the focusing attention, controlling impulse, and sometimes they could see that it could affect empathy. And what we were also spotting, what finally evidence was coming through, there is now, as Susan Greenfield pointed out, evidence of a serious decline in empathy in terms of self-reported levels of empathy among college students, and that's really been significant decline in the last 10 to 15 years. So we're looking at the same period again. And I mean, I could go on about the research, but in every single area there seem to be issues about this. And I have to admit that when I'd gone through them all and I looked at them, it did seem that the electronic media were at the bottom of a lot of it. What was at the bottom of it, to me, was an alliance of marketing and media. They're intrinsically related. And the more screen-based technology you've got, the more marketers were able to get directly to children. So the last 7 years have been quite tricky for me, because while I can see improvements, you can see that people have been campaigning, I can see wonderful work by people like Reg that is making a difference. There is just such an awful lot of it now that we really do need to make sure that all kids get the opportunity for those two things that will make them able to take advantage of the opportunities. And they are manifold. I mean, I personally wouldn't knock technology. I take advantage of it every day. And I realise that in a 21st century world, with the problems that we are facing, the challenges we are facing in terms of things like climate change and so on, we need technology desperately, and we need to be able to use it for good. But those two things that kids need seem to me to be absolutely vital. The first thing is the opportunity to play, and to have real play, the sort of thing that was being described yesterday and that I think we'll hear about again later this afternoon, which is, on the whole, largely the best play, the best remembered play is outdoors, because that's where you learn to focus your attention, because the world, it's slowed down. It's not the rapid speed of everyday modern life. So outdoors, where you can play and make dens and do the things that children have traditionally done throughout history. It tends to be social. And again, if you're outdoors, it's, somebody I think pointed this out yesterday, it's much more easy for children to find out how to get along with each other, because, you know, if anything goes wrong, they can sort of, you know, walk away from it and find something else to play with. There's space. Children who are all crammed indoors don't have the same space to do the negotiation and the learning to deal with the bruised ego if the problems arise. So it's social, it's active, which is keeping them physically fit, which again is hugely important for impulse control. There was a really interesting experiment done in I think it was in the 60s in the States, where they took children of 3, 5 and 7 and did the sort of things that Sally Goddard-Blythe was describing yesterday, just giving them small physical tasks to see how well they could perform them. Things like standing on one leg, making a sequence of movements, balance type activities particularly. And then several years later, they collated the children's results on those tests with their capacity to control impulse in general, to defer gratification, and found that there was a very significant correlation, which Sally would obviously have expected, between their physical control and their mental and social and emotional control. Now, in 2010 in America, they went to a great deal of trouble to replicate that experiment as clearly as they could. And what they found 50 years later, was that the 5-year-old children on the physical tasks were operating at the same level as the 3-year-olds 50 years previously, and the 7-year-olds, sadly, were not even reaching the 5-year-old level. So we are seeing, over time, these changes in empathy levels, impulse levels, and capacity to focus attention, which every single person I talk to says begins in play. Every developmental psychologist, from whichever company they come from, will tell you it begins in children's own self-directed, child-initiated play. The stuff that last week Elizabeth Truss told childminders and nursery workers is not obligatory. But as I said, when it came down to it also, every single one of these chapters, oops, didn't want that. Sometimes runs away with itself, this thing. Every single one of these chapters, I found that alliance between media and marketing was implicated. I mean, in something as obvious as diet, and when I was researching it, there was huge problems about obesity, issues with obesity. The focusing thing was clearly connected with junk food. There is some children, a cocktail of additives will definitely affect their capacity to focus attention. I spoke to many nutritionists but the two, Alex Richardson from Oxford and then Susan Jebb from Cambridge, both of them made that point. And similarly, Alex Richardson was particularly concerned at the time with the huge amounts of trans fats that were in food. This is another good news story. Trans fats are being removed from an awful lot of products. Can I just say, an awful lot of junk food is still cooked in trans fat, and it is really, really bad for brain function, as well as putting a lot of weight on you. So that's a piece of information to give to kids, to parents. But things are improving in terms of some of the ingredients, but not a lot. But if, when parents are trying to feed their children well and healthily, they're saying, you know, come on, eat this lovely cabbage, it's good for you. If there's somebody else on the screen in the corner of your room who's giving a completely different message, it's awfully hard for parents to do what they know is in their children's interest, because that message is a powerful one. We know how powerful it is. At the time that I was writing the book, the organisation Sustain was working very hard on banning junk food advertising to children, and indeed that looked like another little triumph, because there was a ban on junk food adverts in children's programming. However, it turned out that 17 of the 25 most commonly watched programs, I think that's the statistic, 17 out of 25, the most commonly watched programs by children are not children's programs. So there's always this sort of suspicion at the back of my mind that there's a cynicism in here. That advertisers and PR men, that's what they're good at, adverts and PR. So they can, to some extent, pull the wool over our eyes and keep us thinking, you know, let's keep them on. That's why I have to admit, I'm sorry, Reg, I go out on the other direction. I really do think it would be helpful to have something quite simple, like a blanket ban on marketing to children under the age of 12. I think that would not only, I mean, yeah, they'd try to find their way around, of course they would, but it would give a very strong message, and it would also give a message to parents, because at the moment I don't think most parents, I know because I go out talking to them all the time, most parents have absolutely no idea of the amount of advertising that is being, and the type of advertising that's being directed at their children. They just aren't aware of it. I'd like to see it, marketing in general, being reined right in on children. If anybody agrees with me, do go on a new website, leaveourkidsalone.org. They've got a petition going for it. And please make use of new technology. Spread that information around if you think it's information other people should know. And see if they can... I think even if they don't make any change, it's a consciousness-raising issue. And it's constant, that's what we've constantly got to be doing, helping parents to recognise it. The thing, though, that particularly bothers me is that if play is so important, and being outdoors playing is so important, it has been screen-based technology has been part of the problem that's kept children indoors. I know that what was said, I think it was Tim Gill that said very rightly that the main thing that's keeping children indoors, it was the wonderful young women from Playing Out. The main problem that really does keep children indoors is traffic. And that is a really rational problem. But if, knowing what we know now, that outdoor play of this kind is so important, if it were just traffic, I think, like those Alice and Ingrid yesterday, we would be making enormous efforts to get round that problem, to educate our children about the problems, about how to cross the road, make sure that we go out with them daily, walk with them through the street, show them how you press the green button, demonstrate constantly over and over and over again, which is what Susan Greenfield pointed out, what you need, lots and lots of repetition, absolute overlearning of important things. We'd teach them those skills, and we'd also do everything we could to ensure traffic calming in our areas, and then we'd be able to let them out. Unfortunately, that's not what people are doing. They're taking them everywhere in the car, thus adding to the traffic. Now, this isn't rational. An enormous amount of behaviour is not rational. And what talking to neuroscientists told me was that part of the reason for that, perhaps the main part of it, is to do with screen-based technology. Because if we're constantly watching emotionally destabling images on screens over and over and over again, they go straight to our emotional centres, and exactly what Susan was describing yesterday happens. We react emotionally. Now, to any parent, the most frightening thing is some sort of danger to your child. And I remember as a parent, my own daughter would have been about 14 at the time, when I watched repeatedly, day in, day out, two little girls wearing red football shirts and standing underneath a clock. Does anyone remember that photograph as vividly as I do? That was the first time, I think, that rolling news, constant rolling news, was affecting the vast majority of the parents in the country. And what it did was it made you think, oh my goodness, that might happen to my child. Because it's straight into your amygdala. That's why I'm such a believer in Neil Postman. He wrote a book called The Disappearance of Childhood way back in the 80s, which he said childhood would disappear once screen-based technology reached saturation point. Because what has, for the last 500 years, divided off children from adults is the capacity to read. And reading is very, very important. And until you're about 8 or 9 or 10, and you can't read, you were effectively kept out of the adult world. He also said that reading was what had made us civilized, pointing out that most civilizations, one of the facets of a civilization is a written language. And that it was when we got the printing press in the 15th century that the spread of democracy began, as more and more people seemed able to read. His line that I loved was, print means a slowed down mind. The written and then the printed word brought a new kind of social organization to civilization. It brought logic, science, education, civility. He also points out that electronics speeds up the mind, and that the long, slow process of acquiring literacy is more difficult for children living in a world that's speeding up all the time. So it seems to me that what screen-based technology is doing, and not intentionally, nobody's set out to do this, but it's cutting us off from the two very things that are important in order for us to be able to use it sensibly. First, play. We may know, as Tim says, that these things are desperately important. We may know, as many people have told us, that all sorts of things are better when children play out in green places. And yet, we may know all these things. We do know all these things. But it's not happening. Please God, the activities of the people that are working this afternoon, speaking this afternoon, will start to make a difference. But we've got to keep pushing it, because unless they get that play, they won't be able to settle to read, and then they won't get the education, the civility that is so important. I mean, I'm so grateful that Susan Greenfield has thrown her hat into the ring on this question, because I'm just a teacher of literacy. But having talked to her, things that seem to me to make sense, now she can give me a sort of scientific background. It seems to me that when you learn to read, and there is now neuroscientific evidence that when children learn to read, it's not just being able to read. It's not just being able to get information from a book. It's something to do with what it does to your brain, the actual getting of literacy. And what it is that it makes you slow down, focus, and think in a linear, sequential way. You have to do it. You have to sort of train your brain into this linear, sequential processing pattern. And Susan says that you heard her talk yesterday, that narrative is the thing that makes us work as human beings. I mean, the major thing is language. We are the symbolic species that has learnt to use language. And the point about language is that it is sequential. It comes out of my mouth in a long, thin string, and it goes into your ear in a long, thin string, so we're processing in a sequential way. And that very fact that we think in stories, in long, thin strings of thought, with a beginning, a middle, and an end, that very fact makes us able to see forward and plan, to think backward and explain cause and effect, to actually get the whole idea of what logic is. Animals can't do it, we can, and language facilitates it. Brilliant though spoken language is, it's been written language which has given far more people that potential to think in logical, sequential ways. So the actual getting of literacy is hugely important. And if we're not getting literacy, we might not learn. We might not have that capacity in the future to make those decisions for ourselves. Sleep. We're finding more and more kids were not getting enough sleep. It's still a huge issue. And one of the main reasons is that most children, at the time I was writing, had TVs and other electrical equipment in their bedrooms. It was 80% at the time. That was figures from 2004. As Reg said, that's actually gone down. Middle-class families particularly have started to recognise that if they've got tellies in their bedrooms, children are being targeted directly by marketers, they're being often upset by things that they're seeing, parents can't control it, and they have recognised the effect it has on sleep because it's the light from and the stimulating images immediately before sleep. However, the minute you solve the Irish question, the Irish changed the question, handheld devices are now going up to bed with them. This is what I hear constantly from parents. So the children are taking these handheld devices up, and parents tell me proudly that he's reading his Kindle before he goes to sleep. The research is now showing that the light from a Kindle or other handheld device is even more likely to disrupt sleep than the light from a television, because it's the quality of light that's coming out. So kids that's the next thing. Just no electronic equipment in bedrooms is the only way to go. In terms of communication, I found that because we've now got so many ways to communicate with each other, we're talking less and less and less to our children. Oh gosh, I won't go into that one, that's too long, but we know that in terms of attachment, talking and singing and spending time with babies is the most important thing. If anyone gets the chance to watch Babyhood, the film, are we able to show it? It is a splendid film. And just the whole of society, it seems to me, depends on two things that children get in their early life: attachment and play. And then we build education on top of that. You get those three, you're on. You don't get those three, things can go to hell in a handcart. In fact, as I said, every single topic, I'm going to skip to education and childcare, because that's the thing that I'm personally involved in. I've already said how important I think it is that they read, but when you're talking about getting them reading, we've got to think about what happens before they are expected to read. And this is really bothering me so much that our early years policy now is about trying to cram children into for some, we know it's important, so let's get it started earlier. Let's push it down into early years. As a literacy specialist, I didn't know one way or the other whether this was a good idea. I decided I would find out by visiting different countries that did it differently from us. And it only took a week in Finland for me to realise that they had a much better system of kindergarten education than we could ever so far have dreamt of. Largely because they recognise that while the world might be moving at incredible speed, forgive this, it's very out of date, because it's now 7 years old, and therefore wildly out of date. There's all sorts of things missing from there. I didn't have Wi-Fi when I made this. We didn't even have handheld devices. Oh yeah, they did. There were some tablets, but the iPad wasn't invented, for goodness sake, until late 2010. Can you imagine that? It didn't come on the market until just over 2 years ago. And yet it's everywhere. Facebook didn't arrive until the year the book was published, which was 2007. So that didn't get on there. And I didn't have a sat-nav then either. It's very out of date, but it does give some indication of how rapidly the world's going. What the Scandinavians have recognised is that while the world might be moving at that speed, the children can't. That their brains, when they're born, are still the same as they were way back in Stone Age times. They have to be, because that's the glory of the human being. We are so adaptable to our circumstances, and therefore we learn to adapt. But if we learn to adapt too quickly to this rapid world, we'll miss out on all the stuff that underpins the capacity to focus attention, control impulse, and get along with each other, which are the things that have got us to this stage of civilization in the first place. The play and the things that our ancestors devised, which were like grown-up play, which have eased children through the millennia into the adult world. And what were those things? They're the things I saw happening in a Finnish kindergarten. Music, hugely important. They do it all day. I said, why do you do so much music? Why do you do so much singing? It's lovely, but is there an educational reason? And the Finnish teacher looked at me and said, yes. Music trains the mind to pattern and the ear to sound. Of course it does. Particularly good for boys, actually, as the army knows, Get them moving to music together. Music trains the mind to pattern. Music trains the mind to sound, yeah? We've always known it. We've always known that moving to music and dance and so on is an incredibly socializing force. It helps impulse control because you're moving together, you're patterning behavior. So song and music. And the other thing, of course, that we've always done And Susan gave a hint of that. It's stories. Lots of stories. The same stories over and over again. There'd be one story that they told every day in the kindergarten. And the children, by the end of the week, would be joining in. And then they'd be picking it up and turning it into, oh my goodness me, a play. They'd do their own play of it, making their own props and costumes, and turning the story into play. So stories and song, play, lots of art activities, an enormous amount of opportunity to get out and about with other children, and then adult organised activities, which were few at the beginning when the children were 3 and became more as they got older, but which were all oral. Until children were 7, when most of them would just take to reading and writing like ducks to water, because they were ready. The difference from what I saw there and what I saw when I came back, a completely new way of looking at things in British foundation stage and early key stage 1, was really depressing, actually. I do agree with, I can't remember, it was Wendy yesterday, there is some amazing practice. And I have seen amazing practice in both foundation and key stage 1. But in so many schools, this downward press of, you know, you've got to get on with it, you've got to crack on with it, is pulling it away. And the most recent thing that worries me hugely has been the importing of the iPad into key stage 1 and foundation stage, so that we're pushing them into using technology. Basically, what I've learned would suggest to me, until they're 7, 8, 9, keep it real. Get them learning to live in the real world with what we've learnt from our ancestors through the ages, will help civilize them, get them ready to learn, and then they can take advantage of this amazing world. Once they can read and write, they'll be able to, and they've had plenty of opportunities to play, and they're developing other interests as well. This stuff will not become their default activity. They'll be able to take advantage of living in this global electronic village, which has done an immense amount already, I think, to unite us. These will be the sort of risks that we've got to keep an eye open for. If they start too soon, it becomes a default activity. If they're not spending time with other people and engaged in face-to-face activity, we may have social and emotional problems, and they may be encountering inappropriate material. And that's the other thing I would love to see happen, and government has refused to do so far. That is an opt-in approach to pornography, rather than the current opt-out one, which Rhetoric is describing. However, even when I was writing Toxic Childhood, I did make the point. It can be a tremendous force for good. What we've got to make sure is that we get our children ready to be able to use it by the sorts of things that have been done, time-honoured activities that have gone on forever. Thank you very much indeed.